Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Spiritual Research Center here in Hamilton, Ontario. My name is Zachary Strong, and I am an engineering physics graduate and biblical scholar. And today I'm going to be walking you through a number of amazing correspondences between the first chapter of Genesis and Big Bang physics. So, if you've gone to school in the Western world, you've probably learned about the Big Bang Theory and how scientists have discovered that the universe used to be this tiny point of energy and then it exploded into the universe that we know and love today. Um, and this is all very interesting. Like, Big Bang physics is quite interesting stuff. However, what you probably didn't learn in school is that the Bible, and specifically the first chapter of the Bible, talks about some of the same things that scientists have only discovered over the last 100 years or so. Okay, so I'm not going to be discussing all of the, controversies between science and the Bible in this video. All I'm going to be doing is showing you various correspondences that demonstrate that the Bible contains impossible knowledge about creation. Okay? The kinds of things that scientists have discovered over the last 100 years would have been impossible to know 3,000 years ago. And the fact that in the first chapter of Genesis, some impossible knowledge exists, I think is quite interesting and should probably lead you to think twice about whether or not the Bible is, as unreliable as the scientists say it is. So in this video, I'm going to be giving you a quick overview of Big Bang physics and how it came to be. We're going to be examining some unsolved mysteries in cosmology. We're going to be looking at what a new paradigm in physics might be. And also we're going to be, and finally, we're going to be looking at what Judaism teaches about creation and the various correspondences that exist. So, let's start with an overview of Big Bang physics. Okay, so this might come as a surprise to you, but up until the time the Big Bang Theory was developed, a lot of scientists and philosophers had the opinion that the universe was steady state or eternal. Okay, the assumption was that the universe had just always been here. Okay, but in the 1920s, an astronomer named Edwin Hubble was observing various distant galaxies. Okay, and when he did an analysis of the light signatures of those galaxies, he found that the light signatures tended towards the red side of the spectrum. And the farther away a galaxy was, the more red it was. Okay, now you might know of something called the Doppler effect, where, like, if you think of a fire truck passing by you, okay, the sound changes depending on whether or not it's coming towards you or going away from you. The same thing works for light. Okay, and it turns out that if something like a galaxy is moving away from the observer, the light shifts towards the red end of the spectrum. Okay, it's kind of like the Doppler effect for light. And so when Edwin Hubble was observing this, he realized that galaxies were moving away from us, and the furthest galaxies away from us were moving away faster. Okay, so basically when he looked out at the universe, he saw an expansion. Okay, galaxies were moving away from us, which means that the universe must be expanding. Okay, so that was kind of the key discovery that led Big Bang physics to come about. Okay, because scientists, when they heard this information, they basically sat and thought about it, and they realized, wait, if the universe is expanding, that means it must have been smaller in the past. Okay, and basically they did a backwards extrapolation and realized that the entire universe must have once been a very small point. Okay, which then exploded into the universe. So that's how Big Bang physics came about. Now, the interesting thing about this is that once scientists realized this, they had to start asking themselves questions about what the early universe must have been like. Okay, and what must have happened in the early years or millennia of the universe. Okay, and so that brings us to unsolved mysteries in cosmology. Unsolved mysteries in cosmology. So the first mystery that scientists had uncovered, or the first one that we'll discuss, is known as the singularity problem. And we find this in a paper called The Inflationary Universe by a professor who's now at Stanford. And basically he says, one may wonder what was before the singularity. Basically, what was before the Big Bang. If our universe did not exist at time is less than 0, how could it have originated from nothing? The singularity problem is certainly one of the most puzzling problems of contemporary science. Okay, so once scientists figured out that there was a Big Bang, okay, the obvious question is, where did all of this energy and stuff come from? Right? If there was a singularity, if everything used to be a tiny point, where did that tiny point come from? Okay, and as the paper says, it's considered one of the most puzzling problems of modern science. Okay, also in that paper, we find that Andre Linde said that it's absolutely unclear why our universe was created flat or almost flat with such fantastic accuracy. Okay, I'm not going to go into what he means when he means flat universe, but basically he's saying that like the fact that our universe was created the way that it was and that it works the way that it does, it's crazy. It's crazy. How could everything just work so well, right? So that's rather interesting and rather mysterious. Now, in the past couple of years, there's something called the observer problem, which has arisen, and basically, like our universe also operates on a quantum level, okay? And in order for quantum things to collapse into material things, there needs to be an observer. Okay, and so there's been an outstanding question of, before there was consciousness, before there was any life in the universe, how could anything have collapsed into matter? Okay, why isn't the universe still just a quantum soup? Okay, and some physicists have released a paper called Killing Horizons Decohere Quantum Superpositions, and they suggest that the event horizons of black holes and the edge of the universe itself acts as a form of observer. Okay, now I'm obviously a theist, so I'm asking the question, what is on the other side of the edge of the universe that would cause this observation? And perhaps this other side might be relevant to physics. Okay. So as you can tell, there are some outstanding mysteries of science that have to do with the Big Bang and the creation of the universe and how the universe functions the way that it does. Okay? And what I'm suggesting, and what I've suggested in some of my written work, is that we need to move towards a new paradigm in physics and a new paradigm in cosmology. Okay? And when I say paradigm, I'm actually using this as a technical term. Okay, so a paradigm in science is a set of agreed upon answers to questions like, what should we observe? What kind of questions should we be asking? What kind of things should we be exploring? How should we be structuring these questions? What predictions can we reasonably make? How should we interpret the results of studies? How should we conduct experiments? And so on. Okay, so this is a paradigm. And right now, we're stuck in kind of a materialistic, atheistic paradigm. Okay, and we can see this because in the paper about the edge of the universe being an observer, okay, the people wrote the paper, they released the paper, but nobody is asking the question, why does the edge of the universe act as an observer? Right? No one is asking the question right now, what is beyond the edge of our universe? What is beyond space-time? Okay, and so what I'm suggesting is that we need to be thinking very differently about physics. We need to be thinking differently about cosmology, right? And in the same way, we need to be asking ourselves seriously, how could the universe have originated from basically nothing, right? Why is there something instead of nothing to begin with, right? These are valid questions. These are very valid questions. And right now, scientists are trying to avoid anything to do with theism because obviously that would be embarrassing for them and probably inconvenient. Okay. However, when we look at what Judaism teaches, we find that the discoveries that scientists have made over the last 100 years line up very closely with what is written in the first chapter of Genesis. Okay, so the singularity problem was already discussed in the first chapter of Genesis. The universe had a beginning. Okay? The very first line of the Bible, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim wa et haaretz. In the beginning of God's creation of the heavens and the earth. Okay, so the Bible told us 3,000 years ago that there was a beginning, at a time when most people assumed that the universe was eternal. Okay, and also a Jewish sage named Onkelos taught that the universe started out as a tiny point and grew from there. Okay, and we also find this in the Talmud, which I'll show you in a second. Okay, so the Bible already knew that there was a beginning of the universe thousands of years before physicists came to that conclusion. Okay, which I think is pretty remarkable. Okay, also, there was no matter in the early universe. Okay, scientists discovered that the early universe was basically a high energy point and didn't really have any matter. Okay, and the Bible says, now the earth was astonishingly empty, which means there's no matter. Okay, and it also says, darkness was on the face of the deep. Now, physicists approach this by saying that the universe was opaque. Okay, and so what that means is that the universe in its early stages was basically a hot soup of particles like protons, neutrons, and electrons. Okay, and the energy of the universe was so high that the electrons were not able to bind to the protons, and so you didn't even have matter. You didn't even have hydrogen. It was just all energy and particles. Okay, now when the universe started cooling down, the protons and neutrons began combining into ionized forms of atoms of hydrogen, and then as the electrons attached to them, it freed them up from the photons, which allowed light to travel freely for the first time. So darkness was on the face of the deep, as scientists have discovered. Okay, light was not able to travel freely as photons because everything was mixed up together in a soup. Okay, and then as the universe cooled down, God said, let there be light, and there was light. Okay, and God separated between the light and between the darkness. Okay, and so what this seems to indicate is that the Bible has correct and accurate information about the early universe. Okay, darkness was on the face of the deep because everything was mixed together. As hydrogen started forming and electrons attached to it, light could travel freely for the first time. And then there was light. Okay, and the light had been separated from the darkness. So I think that is quite interesting. That is quite interesting. Now also, not necessarily the Bible, but the Talmud discusses how the universe expanded. Okay? In Tractate Hagiga 12a, we find that when God created the world, it continued to expand like balls of yarn. Okay? Until God rebuked them and made them stop expanding. Okay? And that's where the divine name El Shaddai comes from, because God said, to the universe, okay, stop expanding. Okay? Now, a consequence of this is that the universe is no longer expanding. Scientists are assuming that the universe has kept expanding, but the Talmud indicates that it has stopped expanding, It just happens to be very, very, very large. Okay, so what we have here are multiple points of correspondence between Big Bang physics and Genesis. First of all, Genesis says that the universe had a beginning, which scientists ended up coming to. Okay, Genesis also says that there was darkness on the face of the deep and that light became separated from darkness. Okay, and scientists have come to those conclusions as well. The Talmud teaches that the universe was expanding, which scientists came to through Big Bang physics. Okay, and the redshift thing. And all of these things in the Bible and the Talmud predate modern science by thousands of years. Okay, and so this should represent to you impossible knowledge. Impossible knowledge. Okay, there are multiple points of correspondence here. Okay, and there is no way that ancient people could have correctly figured these things out. Okay. Now, that's all I really had to talk about in this video. The question of the universe being 13.8 billion years versus 6,000 years, that's probably a topic for another video. However, if you're interested in biblical proofs, I've got a number of them. So in addition to these correspondences from Genesis, we have hard evidence for the biblical Exodus. And in one of my videos, I explain in detail how and when the Exodus happened. There's also a biblical prophecy about the Nuremberg trials hidden in the book of Esther. You can find that on my channel. There's something known as the Kuzari principle, which is basically a blockchain style proof for Judaism. And then also for the philosophers watching, I've got a few philosophical arguments for God. Okay, so anyway, if you're interested in a written version of this, okay, if you like books, my book called Ticket to Heaven has all of this and more. Okay, so I talk about Exodus in detail in this book, all sources cited. I talk about Genesis in this book, all sources cited. And, there are a number of other books available, such as The 6 Days of Creation by Rabbi Alexander Houle. And you can get a Kindle book or a paperback copy of Genesis and the Big Bang by Dr. Gerald Schroeder. Okay. So, yeah, if you're interested in this stuff, the information is out there. And, especially when it comes to the Exodus, like we've got archaeological proofs and archaeological evidence and so on. So, yeah, if you're a Bible person, things are coming together quite nicely. God is winning in the end. So, yeah, thanks very much for watching. Like and subscribe for more.